Welcome to the Riddles and Secrets of History channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. To understand why the Vatican Archives evoke so much mystery and speculation today, one must go back many centuries to a time when not only the power of the Catholic Church was being born, but also the very idea of preserving and accumulating knowledge as a form of power. For in ancient times, knowledge was not for everyone. It was always the prerogative of the chosen. Imagine Rome at the end of the 1st century. The empire is torn between internal strife and external threats. But it is at this time that the Church begins to gain strength, becoming the new core that would replace the former imperial grandeur. The popes of Rome gradually become not only spiritual authorities but also political figures, on whose decisions the fates of states depended. And it was then that the need arose to preserve documents, treaties, charters, and letters from rulers who recognized the authority of Rome. The archives were not formed as a single room, but as a network of repositories where scribes and monks kept scrolls and books. In those days, the main treasure was not gold or artifacts, but the word written on parchment. This word could change a king's decision, determine the legitimacy of land ownership, or even become the basis for declaring war. Later, in the Middle Ages, the archives became a true center of power. Every letter that came from emperors or princes was proof of the Pope's power. Imagine a dark hall where scrolls, wrapped in red ribbons, lie on shelves, and each of them is a witness to events that chroniclers often forgot, but which were kept for the eyes of a few. Pope Leo III played a special role, actively corresponding with Charlemagne in the 8th century. These documents recorded not only politics but also the very fact of Charlemagne's coronation, which effectively restored the Western imperial tradition. These papers became the foundation for the idea of the Holy Roman Empire. Without the archives, we would know much less about this today. With each century, the archives grew. Popes ordered the collection of everything, from bulls and official decrees to personal letters in which kings asked for support. And here we see the most important feature: the archives were never just a repository. They were a weapon. The Pope could, at the right moment, pull out an ancient document and use it against a ruler or a bishop, proving his superiority. In the 12th century, under Pope Innocent III, the archives reached unprecedented development. It was then that Rome began to collect documents from all corners of Europe. Letters from England, France, Spain, and even from the distant Slavic lands found their place in the repositories. These documents gave the Pope a unique map of the world's political realities. One must imagine the atmosphere of the time. In the dark libraries of monasteries, in the narrow corridors of the Vatican, scribes bent over tables, noting every word. They knew that their work would not be for the public, but for the chosen few, those who held the levers of power. For ordinary people, these records were inaccessible. Even many cardinals did not have free access to them. But most interesting is the very idea of secrecy. While many medieval libraries, particularly at the universities of Bologna or Paris, were open to scholars, the Vatican created its archives specifically as a space of silence and secrecy. Why? Because secrecy enhances authority. When you possess knowledge unavailable to others, you become stronger. During the Renaissance, the archives became even more powerful. Popes like Sixtus IV and Leo X realized that their power rested not only on military strength or finances but also on control over history. If you control history, you shape the future. During this period, the archives began to be filled with manuscripts of ancient authors brought from different lands. Many of them were preserved precisely thanks to the Vatican, but at the same time, the archives became a place where unnecessary and dangerous documents were hidden. Records that could cast doubt on the authority of the papacy or cause scandals were sent to the repository. And here begins the real history of secrets, because some documents that could tell us more about alternative versions of the Gospels or the history of the first centuries of Christianity remained inaccessible. In the 17th century, Pope Paul V officially organized the archives into the form we know today. It was then that the structure known as the Vatican Secret Archives was created. The word secret in this context did not mean mystical or mysterious. It meant private. It was an archive that belonged only to the Pope and was his personal property. But for a world that had no access to these riches, this word became a symbol of mystery and inaccessibility. Since then, the Vatican Archives have become one of the most protected institutions in Europe. They contain millions of documents, over 80 kilometers of shelves, and hundreds of thousands of storage units. And all this is a history that could change our understanding of the past. But when we talk about the origin of the archives, we are not just talking about popes and scribes. We are talking about an idea that has survived centuries, the idea of power through knowledge. The Vatican Archives are not just a repository of papers. They are a symbol that the past can be a weapon, and silence can be the loudest scream. Medieval secrets. When we speak of the Middle Ages, we often imagine dark castles, inquisitors, crusaders, and magnificent cathedrals. But behind this facade of Gothic splendor hid another reality, a world of documents, letters, and bulls that had the power to turn the fates of states and people. And it is in the Vatican Archives that these witnesses to the events we call medieval secrets were kept. In those times, the Church was not only a spiritual institution, it was one of the main political players in Europe. Popes intervened in the conflicts of kings, decided issues of succession to thrones, and blessed or cursed rulers. All of this was accompanied by documents that had enormous legal force. Imagine how in the 12th century, letters from the kings of England or France arrived at the Vatican. They were written on parchment, adorned with seals, and every line was a testament to submission or, on the contrary, defiance. The archives preserved such documents, and it was they that allowed the Pope to control the situation. If a king promised tribute or recognized the authority of Rome, that document became a weapon. One of the greatest secrets of the medieval archives was the issue of coronations. No monarch in Europe could consider his power legitimate without the blessing of the Church. The archives preserved confirmation of these acts, charters, correspondence, and the terms of alliances. Without these papers, history could have been completely different. The period of the Crusades deserves special mention. The Vatican kept thousands of documents related to the organization of campaigns to the East. These letters described not only spiritual motives but also very specific financial agreements. Who would provide the army? What lands were promised for participation in the crusade? How would the spoils be divided? Imagine a document in which it is written in black and white that a certain baron will receive part of the conquered land in Palestine. This was political and economic planning, hidden under religious rhetoric. No less important is the history of the struggle between the popes and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV left behind entire volumes of correspondence. It is in these archives that one can find records of the famous walk to Canossa, when the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days to receive forgiveness. This event became a symbol of the power of the papacy over kings. And all of this has been preserved in the form of documents that now lie in the Vatican's repositories. The medieval archives also contained materials about heresies. Any new idea that deviated from official doctrine fell under suspicion, letters from bishops about dangerous preachers, testimonies of secret gatherings, even denunciations from peasants. All of this was meticulously recorded and preserved. This is where the practice of the Inquisition originated: first, gather information, then use it against the accused. Interestingly, some archival documents preserve not only official facts but also personal dramas. Imagine a village community in the 13th century writing to Rome with a complaint against their priest for abusing his power. Or a monk, suspected of witchcraft, writing a desperate letter asking for a pardon. These voices have long been silenced, but their echoes are hidden in the archives. A separate layer of medieval secrets is connected with knowledge. In those times, the Church had an almost complete monopoly on education. The archives preserved ancient texts, translations of Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates, but only a select few had access to them. For most people, knowledge remained locked away. Imagine how many generations did not know about these texts simply because they lay in locked repositories. Another interesting topic is documents about other religions. The Vatican closely monitored the development of Islam, the spread of Judaism in Europe, and the remnants of pagan beliefs. Reports from missionaries and intelligence about the customs of other peoples, all this formed a picture of the world that ordinary people never saw. The financial aspect is also worth mentioning. The archives contained information about the tithe, the mandatory taxes collected from the faithful. In these documents, one can trace how money flowed from remote villages into the rich treasuries of Rome. And these financial records were no less important than theological treatises because they showed the real, economic power of the Church. The Middle Ages were also a time of secret alliances and agreements. The Vatican often acted as a mediator between warring parties. The archives preserve charters on the conclusion of peace, the exchange of hostages, and marriage alliances, for example, documents about the marriage of French and English dynasties, which was intended to stop a war. These agreements determined the fate of nations, but their true terms remained known only to a few. And now let's try to imagine that all these documents have been preserved. They lie in special rooms, accessible only to select researchers. The medieval secrets have not disappeared, they are simply hidden behind the walls of the Vatican, and we know only what we are allowed to know. All this creates the feeling that the Vatican Archives are not just a library, but a time machine. It can transport us to the Middle Ages, show us the true faces of kings, popes, heretics, and ordinary people. But this machine works only for those who are allowed to look inside. That is why the medieval secrets of the archives still stir the imagination, because we understand that behind those thick walls lie the answers to questions that remain unanswered in our textbooks. Among all the riches of the Vatican Archives, one of the most interesting and, at the same time, mysterious layers is the correspondence between popes and monarchs. These are not just official documents or diplomatic pleasantries. They are living testimonies of how the history of Europe was shaped, how the fates of states and entire nations were decided. Behind each letter stood the emotions, fears, hopes, and ambitions of the people who ruled the world. Imagine a royal court in the 12th or 13th century. Servants prepare the parchment. A scribe writes out the address to the Holy See in golden letters. The king dictates the words, weighing each sentence. After all, not only politics but his own fate could depend on the tone of the letter. These letters traveled for weeks over mountains and seas and finally reached Rome. And there, in the quiet rooms of the Vatican, scribes preserved them in repositories that we now call the archives. One of the most striking examples of such correspondence is the history of the English kings. It is known that in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III actively intervened in the affairs of England. It was he who forced King John Lackland to submit and recognize England as a vassal of the Holy See. This fact is recorded in documents that are still kept in the Vatican. Imagine a monarch of a great state writing a letter in which he swears allegiance to the Pope, and that document becomes evidence for future generations. But the letters were not only about submission. Often, they had the character of a real diplomatic game. The kings of France, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire tried to win the Pope over to their side in conflicts. These messages contained promises, threats, and even hidden insults, all written in exquisite language with impeccable addresses to the Most Holy Father. Special attention should be given to the letters concerning the Crusades. Monarchs appealed to the Pope for his blessing on their campaigns, to grant indulgences to their soldiers, and to secure the support of other states. In these documents, one can see how religious motives were intertwined with political ambitions. A king might write about liberating the Holy Sepulchre, but between the lines, one could feel the desire to gain new lands and riches. No less interesting is the correspondence with the monarchs of Eastern Europe. For example, the kings of Poland and Hungary actively corresponded with the Vatican, seeking support in their struggle against neighboring peoples. These letters also mention the lands of Rus, as it was a time of discussing the baptism of princes and possible alliances with Rome. For us, Ukrainians, these documents are extremely important. They show how the Vatican saw our lands and what place it assigned them in its plans. A true gem of the archives is the correspondence with the monarchs of Spain during the Age of Discovery. It was to the Vatican that reports of new lands, encounters with the Indians, and countless riches were sent. The Pope decided to whom the discovered territories belonged, Spain or Portugal. The famous Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the two states, also has its origins in these letters. And all of this is in documents that lie in the Vatican's repositories. But correspondence with monarchs is not only about major geopolitical decisions, it is also about very personal appeals. For example, kings often ask the Pope to bless their children or to confirm the legitimacy of a marriage or succession. Imagine a king writing a letter to Rome, begging for his son to be recognized as the heir to the throne. And the fate of a dynasty is decided not by the sword, but by the pen in the hands of the pontiff. There were also dramatic moments. The letters of the French King Philip IV, who entered into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, are well known. This confrontation ended tragically. The Pope was humiliated and died shortly after the conflict. And it all began with an exchange of long letters, full of accusations and threats. These texts, preserved in the Vatican, show how words could become a weapon no less powerful than armies. Another striking example is the letters of Mary, Queen of Scots. In her correspondence, she appealed to the Pope for support in her struggle for the throne. These were the words of a woman who knew her life was hanging by a thread. And although her requests were not always heeded, these letters remain as a testament to how much monarchs relied on the support of the Vatican. If you think about it, the Vatican Archives are not only the history of the Church but also the history of Europe's monarchies. For without these letters, we would not know what rulers felt and thought in moments of greatest danger or greatest ambition. These were their confessions, though veiled in official style. And today, these documents remain the subject of major research, but access to them is limited. Only a small number of historians have the right to view them, and even they often see only what is permitted. This means that a significant part of this correspondence is still hidden. Perhaps it is there, in those closed volumes, that the answers to questions about the true motives of kings, about secret agreements, about betrayals lie. And it is this that makes the Vatican Archives such an attractive and, at the same time, unsettling place. Because behind every letter stands not only history but also a human soul that longed for power, love, or salvation. Thus, the correspondence with monarchs is a kind of mirror reflection of medieval and early modern Europe. These are not just documents. They are the living voices of kings that still sound through the centuries, hidden in the dark corridors of the Vatican. When we say the word Inquisition, images of dark chambers where candles burn and stern judges in robes interrogate people accused of heresy come to mind. But behind these dramatic pictures stood another, no less important reality: documents. Every trial, every accusation, every confession or verdict was meticulously recorded and found its place in the repositories. It is thanks to these documents that the Inquisition was able to exist for centuries, and they have become one of the most mysterious parts of the Vatican Archives. The first manifestations of the Inquisition appeared in the 12th century when the Church faced the spread of the Cathars in the south of France. This movement, which preached asceticism and denied many Catholic dogmas, was declared dangerous. The popes realized that this problem could not be solved by the sword, as ideas spread faster than troops could suppress uprisings. Then the idea arose to create special tribunals that would investigate, expose, and eradicate heresy. The archives of the Inquisition are not just dry records, they are the living, often tragic, stories of people. Imagine a peasant from a small French town appearing before the court and saying that he only repeated the words of a preacher who spoke of the purity and simplicity of faith. And now his words are entered into a protocol that is preserved for centuries. We would never have known about these people if it were not for the inquisitorial records. One of the most famous documents in the archives is the case file against the Knights Templar. At the beginning of the 14th century, the French King Philip IV the Fair, with the help of Pope Clement V, organized a trial against this powerful order. The Templars were accused of heresy, idol worship, and secret rituals. All the interrogations, confessions under torture, and even details of how the knights were forced to renounce their faith were carefully recorded. These documents remained secret for a long time and are now stored in the Vatican Archives. Historians who have had access to them claim that many of the accusations were fabricated, but the records remain as a testament to one of the greatest trials of the Middle Ages. Another important page is the case of Giordano Bruno. At the end of the 16th century, this thinker advocated ideas that went against official doctrine. He spoke of the infinity of the universe and the existence of other worlds. The Inquisition arrested him, interrogated him for several years, and demanded that he renounce his beliefs. All these interrogations were recorded in protocols. And although Bruno was eventually burned at the stake, his words remained in documents that now lie in the repositories. The archives of the Inquisition also contain a huge number of cases of ordinary people. These are not only philosophers or orders. They are also millions of ordinary Christians who were accused of witchcraft, of misinterpreting the Bible, of attending forbidden gatherings. Records have survived of how a peasant woman could be accused of conspiring with the devil just because she knew about herbs and healed the sick. In these protocols, you can read her words, her tears, her despair. These are voices that have come down to us through the centuries. A special place in the archives is occupied by documents about the witch trials. Although the most massive witch hunts took place in Northern Europe and were not always under the control of Rome, the Inquisition recorded testimonies in both Italy and Spain. Hundreds of records describe women's confessions of night flights, Sabbaths, and pacts with the devil. For us today, this sounds like fantasies under torture, but for a medieval person, it was a terrible reality. One cannot overlook the Spanish Inquisition, which played a special role. It created a gigantic bureaucratic machine where every interrogation, every denunciation was recorded with incredible pedantry. Thousands of volumes are stored in the Vatican Archives and are still inaccessible to the general public. They contain not only verdicts but also statistics and descriptions of property confiscated from the condemned. Thus, the Inquisition not only fought heresy but also replenished the treasury of the state and the Church. It is interesting that the Inquisition always worked in close connection with politics. Many trials were initiated not by the Church, but at the request of monarchs who needed to get rid of dangerous opponents. That is, the archives of the Inquisition are also evidence of political games in which religion was only a cover. But why do these documents remain so important and mysterious today? Because they show a different side of history. In official chronicles, we read about victories, the construction of temples, and holiness. But in the inquisitorial protocols, we see weakness, fear, and pain. This is the history of ordinary people who found themselves in a system where every word could be a death sentence. Modern historians who have worked with these documents say that they allow one to feel the true breath of the era. These are not abstract dates and facts, they are specific names, specific fates. And that is why the Vatican is so cautious about their disclosure. For in these papers lies not only the history of the Church but also its shadows. Thus, the archives of the Inquisition are one of the darkest but also one of the most valuable sources for our understanding of the Middle Ages. They preserve the memory of those who burned at the stake, who sat in dungeons, who held on to their truth until the very end. And as long as these documents lie behind closed doors, we can only guess how many more stories remain unknown. Imagine Italy at the beginning of the 17th century. The Renaissance had already given Europe masterpieces of art, new philosophy, and the rediscovery of the ancient world. But now came the age of science, which was to change the human view of the universe forever. One of the key figures of this era was Galileo Galilei, a man who managed to combine the talents of an observer, an engineer, and a thinker. His story is closely intertwined with the Vatican Archives, as they preserved the documents of the trial that became a symbol of the conflict between science and faith. Galileo was not only a scientist but also a passionate man. He believed in the power of experience and observation, while most of his contemporaries still clung to the authority of ancient texts. When he began to build telescopes and turn them to the sky, he discovered a world that contradicted the teachings of Aristotle and even the traditional interpretation of the Bible. He saw mountains on the moon, sunspots, and the phases of Venus, which could not be explained by the geocentric model of the universe. In his letters and treatises, Galileo supported Copernicus's idea of heliocentrism, that is, that the Earth revolves around the Sun. This was a revolutionary thought that undermined the established order of centuries. For if the Earth is not the center of the universe, then man no longer occupies the unique place that the Church attributed to him. We find the first records of the conflict between Galileo and the Church authorities precisely in the Vatican Archives. They contain the minutes of the meetings of the Holy Office, letters from cardinals discussing his works, as well as denunciations from his opponents. In these documents, we see that the problem was not only about science but also about politics. Galileo had patrons among the powerful families of Italy, and the Church feared that his authority might become too influential. In 1616, the Holy Office officially banned the teaching of Copernicus as erroneous and dangerous. The minutes state that Galileo was ordered not to teach or defend heliocentrism, but he did not stop. His nature was too restless. He believed in the power of experience and observation, not in fear. In 1632, he published his famous work, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In the form of a conversation between three characters, he argued for the advantages of the heliocentric model. This book caused a storm. The Vatican perceived it as a direct challenge. In the archival documents, we read that the main accusation was that Galileo had violated the Order of 1616 and mixed faith with philosophy, misleading ordinary people. The trial of Galileo in 1633 became one of the most famous trials of the Inquisition. The protocols preserve every stage, from his summons to Rome to the final verdict. We can feel the atmosphere of this trial. Galileo, already elderly and ill, stands before stern judges who demand that he recant. He defends himself, trying to prove that his ideas do not contradict the Holy Scripture, but the pressure was too great. According to the documents, he eventually agreed to abjure, curse, and detest the heliocentric doctrine. The verdict sounded harsh: life imprisonment. In reality, he was placed under house arrest, where he spent the rest of his life. But this trial left a deep shadow on the relationship between science and the Church. Of particular value are Galileo's personal records, which are also stored in the Vatican's collections. These are his letters to his daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, who supported him during his most difficult moments. She wrote him words of comfort, and he responded, sharing his fears and, at the same time, his unwavering faith in the truth. In these letters, we see not only a scientist but also a man who suffered but did not lose his dignity. The archival documents also show a dual attitude towards him. On the one hand, he was condemned; on the other, he was not thrown into a dungeon but was allowed to continue his work at home. The Vatican understood that they were dealing not just with a heretic, but with a great mind whose value could not be denied. Interestingly, the archives contain evidence that even after the trial, Galileo continued to work on mechanics and optics, creating new instruments. His spirit was not broken, and it is this that makes his story so magnificent. Many centuries passed, and only in the 20th century did the Church officially admit its error in the Galileo affair. But the archival documents remain a priceless testimony to how the collision of two worlds, the world of faith and the world of science, occurred. These records are also important because they show the human dimension of history. These are not just protocols and orders, they are cries of the soul. This is the struggle between fear and the pursuit of truth. And that is why the case of Galileo has become a symbol for all subsequent generations of scientists who have felt the pressure of power but have continued to search for answers. Thus, the Vatican Archives, which preserve the documents of the trial of Galileo, are not just a memory of one trial. They are a memory of the eternal struggle of man for the right to know, to see, and to discover the world as it is. And perhaps it is in these archives that hundreds of other stories of scientists who once risked everything for the sake of truth are hidden. At the beginning of the 16th century, Europe was experiencing a time of great upheaval. The knightly orders were losing their former glory, kings were strengthening their power, and ordinary people were increasingly questioning the authority of the Church. And it was then that an event began that changed not only the course of European history but the entire world, the Reformation. At the center of this movement were not only sermons and ideas but also letters and documents preserved in the Vatican Archives. These are the secret letters, witnesses of an era when the word became more dangerous than the sword. It all began in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. In them, he openly spoke out against indulgences, the practice that allowed the purchase of forgiveness for sins. His text quickly spread throughout Europe thanks to the printing press. But few know that just a few months after this event, the first secret letters from bishops and nuncios appeared in the Vatican, reporting on the dangerous ideas spreading among the people. These letters, filled with anxiety, are the first evidence of how Rome reacted to the beginning of the Reformation. Imagine the atmosphere of these letters. A bishop writes to Rome, people are gathering in the squares, reading and discussing Luther's theses. They are asking questions to which we have no answers. They are no longer afraid. These lines conveyed the fear of a new force that was being born among ordinary believers. A special place in the archives is occupied by the correspondence of Pope Leo X. At first, he tried to downplay Luther's importance, calling him a drunken German who would soon sober up. But the documents show how quickly the tone changed. In subsequent letters to his legates, the Pope demanded decisive action and preparation for an official condemnation. In 1520, the bull Ex Surge Domini excommunicated Luther from the Church. And this document, adorned with a seal, now lies among the Vatican's manuscripts. But the most interesting are not the official bulls, but the secret letters. They reveal the true atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Legates wrote from Germany that even princes were beginning to support Luther, and universities were openly discussing his ideas. One such letter contains the words, "If we do not stop him, all of Germany may fall into apostasy." In these documents, we see not only official condemnation but also the behind-the-scenes struggle. Papal envoys tried to persuade German princes to remain loyal to Rome, offering political and financial concessions. Some of these negotiations took place secretly, and their details still lie in the archives under the inaccessible classification. Interestingly, among these letters are also reports on the reaction of ordinary people. One of the nuncios wrote that peasants had begun to quote scripture, proving their case to priests. This was unheard of. The Bible, which for centuries had been held only by educated theologians, was now becoming the book of the people. And it was this that frightened Rome the most. The Reformation spread rapidly, and the secret letters multiplied. They testified to the growing danger. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli was speaking out. In France, followers of Luther appeared. In Geneva, John Calvin was rising. In every letter, there is anxiety, sometimes even despair. The cardinals in Rome understood that they were facing not just a heresy, but a new era. The letters concerning the German Peasants' War of 1524–25 are of particular interest in the archives. Although Luther himself distanced himself from the rebellion, many insurgents justified their actions with his ideas. Reports reached the Vatican about peasants who had risen up with the Bible in their hands. For Rome, this was a terrifying signal. The Reformation had moved beyond theological disputes and turned into a social explosion. These secret letters also preserve the stories of individuals who tried to find a compromise. Some bishops wrote to the Pope that harsh persecution would only deepen the schism, proposing to seek dialogue. But most responses from Rome were firm: heresy must be eradicated. The letters related to England are also worth mentioning. When King Henry VIII, in the 1530s, wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, he appealed to the Pope for permission. But the Vatican refused. The archives hold letters in which cardinals warned that a refusal could lead to England's separation from Rome. And so it happened. Henry created his own church. These documents are witnesses to the birth of Anglicanism, which forever changed the face of Britain. The secret letters from the time of the Reformation also reflect the Catholic Church's attempts to respond to the challenges. In 1545, the Council of Trent began, which became the basis of the Counter-Reformation. The Vatican holds letters from this council where new dogmas, disciplinary measures, and even art and education were discussed. It was an attempt to strengthen the authority of the Church and to resist the wave of Protestantism. But what is most striking is that all these documents have been preserved. Imagine how, in the dark halls of the archives, lie yellowed letters, written 5 centuries ago, that convey the emotions of that turbulent era. These are the voices of bishops, princes, kings, and ordinary believers. They tell of fear and hope, of betrayal and faith, of the struggle for the future of Europe. The Reformation changed the map of the world. It led to the creation of new churches, new states, and new ideas. But at the very heart of this story remained the secret letters, documents that show how a new era was born. And today they lie in the Vatican Archives, reminding us that history is not only about great battles but also about the words written by the hand of a person who believed in their truth. Secret knowledge of other religions. The Vatican Archives are often imagined as a repository of papal bulls, correspondence with monarchs, and the protocols of Inquisition trials. But in their depths, there is another special category of documents, records concerning other religions. From the first centuries of Christianity, the Church closely monitored the beliefs of its neighbors, rivals, and even enemies. These were not just theological studies, this was strategic information that helped to build policy, influence peoples, and maintain power. Imagine a medieval missionary setting out for distant lands. He observes, listens, and writes. His notes on customs, beliefs, and rituals then end up in Rome. There, scribes carefully preserve them in special volumes. For the missionary, it was a life's work. For the Church, it was the key to understanding and controlling foreign cultures. One of the first objects of attention was Judaism. Christianity grew out of the Jewish tradition, and therefore the Church always kept an eye on the life of Jewish communities. The archives hold letters and reports about the life of Jews in medieval Europe. There are mentions of their customs, the celebration of Passover, and the peculiarities of their rituals, but alongside this, there are also denunciations of Jewish conspiracies or blasphemies. These documents show a dual attitude: on the one hand, curiosity and an attempt to understand, and on the other, fear and hostility. An equally significant part of the archives is dedicated to Islam. From the 7th century, when Muslims began to conquer new lands, Europe felt threatened. Popes received reports from diplomats, merchants, and missionaries describing Muslim society, its laws, faith, and military strength. These documents preserved descriptions of mosques, quotes from the Quran, and even stories about the customs of Arab rulers. The reports from the time of the Crusades became particularly valuable for historians. They convey not only descriptions of battles but also the daily life of Muslims, their education system, trade, and culture. The archives also preserve unique documents about contacts with the Byzantine Empire and Orthodoxy. Although Christianity remained a common foundation, after the Great Schism of the 11th century, Rome and Constantinople went their separate ways. In the Vatican Archives lie letters discussing the theological difference of the Filioque and the Creed, stories about disputes over rituals, as well as diplomatic attempts at reconciliation. These are not just theological texts, but testimonies of how two branches of Christianity tried to find a common language but drifted further and further apart. A special layer consists of documents concerning the pagan beliefs of Europe. The medieval reports of missionaries preserve details about the rituals of the Germanic peoples, Celts, and Slavs. For example, in the records of bishops, one can find descriptions of solstice celebrations, the worship of trees or springs, and sacrifices. These documents are valuable because many pagan traditions did not leave their own written evidence. Thanks to the archives, we know how the Christianization of Europe took place and how ancient beliefs were gradually supplanted. For Ukrainians, the reports about the Slavic lands are particularly interesting. The Vatican holds letters from missionaries who described our ancient rituals, the veneration of Purim, Kupala festivals, and the belief in household spirits and mermaids. Although these descriptions were often biased and aimed to show the darkness of the pagans, today they are a priceless source of knowledge about the spiritual world of our ancestors. One cannot overlook the documents about Asia. When Christian missions set out for Mongolia and China in the 13th century, their reports also ended up in the Vatican. The archives contain letters from Franciscans who described the Khan's court, his customs, and also mentioned Buddhism and Confucianism. These texts became Europe's first window into the world of the Far East. In the 16th century, when the age of great geographical discoveries began, the Vatican received reports about the religions of the New World. Missionaries described the beliefs of the Incas, Mayas, and Aztecs. The letters spoke of their gods, temples, and rituals of human sacrifice. The Church saw in this both a threat and an opportunity. The conversion of new peoples meant the expansion of influence. And again, these documents became the only sources that preserved unique details of cultures destroyed by colonization. All these materials in the archives had a dual role. On the one hand, they gave Rome knowledge about foreign religions; on the other, they became an instrument of control. By understanding how another people thinks, the Church could better plan missions and determine which ideas to prohibit and which to adapt. Interestingly, some of these documents are still not available for open study. The Vatican cautiously opens the archives only to certain researchers, and only a few volumes have become public. This gives rise to numerous speculations. Perhaps they contain texts that could change our understanding of the history of religions. It is also important to understand that these documents were not always neutral. Missionaries looked at other cultures through the prism of their own faith. They might exaggerate the cruelty of pagan rituals or downplay the wisdom of other philosophies. But despite this, their records are almost the only thing that remains of many vanished traditions. Thus, the Vatican Archives are not only the history of Catholicism. They are also the history of all the religions it encountered. It is a repository of knowledge about Judaism, Islam, Orthodoxy, paganism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and the beliefs of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and America. And this information was so valuable that it was kept behind thick walls, far from the eyes of ordinary people. Today, researchers are only beginning to uncover these treasures, but even the documents that are already known are impressive in scale. They show the world in its diversity, its complexity. And most importantly, they remind us that the history of religions was not isolated. It was always a dialogue, a conflict, a meeting of cultures. Perhaps it is in these secret records that the answers to the questions we still ask today are kept. How were the great religions born, and how did they influence each other? Why did some disappear while others survived? And that is why the Vatican Archives remain a symbol of mystery. They know more than we can imagine. The 19th century was an era when Europe changed beyond recognition. Old empires faltered, and new nations fought for their independence. The Industrial Revolution changed the lives of millions. During this time, the Vatican also faced difficult trials. Its territories were shrinking, and its influence on politics was becoming less obvious, but the role of the archives in the struggle only grew. For it was the documents, secret agreements, reports, and diplomatic correspondence that remained the instrument by which the Holy See continued to influence the fate of the continent. Imagine Rome at the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon's soldiers still walk the streets, and Pope Pius VII is in captivity. The French emperor sought to conquer not only states but spiritual authority itself. The Vatican Archives hold documents from this period, protocols of negotiations, letters from the pontiff to bishops asking for support, and agreements signed under duress. This was a drama not only for the Church but for the very idea of the independence of the Holy See. When the Papal States were restored after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Vatican tried to reassert its influence. At this time, the archives began to accumulate a huge amount of information about revolutionary movements in Italy. The Carbonari, secret societies striving for unity and freedom, became the main enemy of papal officials. The archives contain denunciations, lists of suspects, and even conversations recorded by agents. This shows that the Vatican closely monitored politics, using the archives as a tool of control. The 19th century was also the time when the Roman question arose. Italy was gradually unifying, and the Papal State was under threat. In 1870, the troops of King Victor Emmanuel II entered Rome, and the popes lost their secular power. The archives from this period preserve dramatic documents, letters from Pius IX, in which he called himself a prisoner in the Vatican, minutes of discussions in the College of Cardinals, and even correspondence with Catholic monarchs of Europe who expressed sympathy but were in no hurry to intervene. Interestingly, it was in the 19th century that the papacy tried to find new ways of influence. If before it was primarily military or territorial power, now the main instrument became diplomacy. In the Vatican archives of this period, we find tens of thousands of documents, reports from nuncios from various countries. They described political sentiments, revolutionary movements, and the state of the Catholic Church on the ground. This was a real intelligence network that allowed Rome to know more than the governments themselves knew. A figure of particular interest in the 19th century archives is Pius IX. It was he who convened the First Vatican Council in 1869, where the dogma of papal infallibility was proclaimed. The documents preserve the discussions of this decision, letters from bishops from different countries, some of whom expressed doubts or even protest. But after the council, all these voices were silenced, and only the archives today allow us to see how dramatically and ambiguously this step was perceived in the world. In the mid-19th century, the Vatican took an active interest in events in Eastern Europe. The archives contain reports on the Polish uprisings against the Russian Empire, on the situation of Greek Catholics in the Ukrainian lands, and on the fate of Catholics in the Balkan countries. This once again proves that Rome closely followed every nation where there was even a small community and tried to influence the policies of large empires. One cannot overlook the documents related to colonial policy. In the 19th century, European states were actively dividing Africa, Asia, and America. Letters from missionaries arrived at the Vatican, describing local cultures, religions, and the difficulties of evangelization. In these texts, we see both sincere enthusiasm and deep disappointment. The archives have preserved hundreds of stories about how missionaries faced epidemics, famine, and resistance from local peoples. But for the papal curia, these letters were also political reports. They provided information about the state of the colonies, their wealth, and resources. The 19th century was an age of science, and the Vatican did not stand aside. The archives contain documents about the Church's attitude towards Darwin's theory of evolution. Papal advisors discussed whether to condemn the new ideas or whether it was better to remain silent. In these protocols, we see hesitation. Some theologians considered Darwin dangerous, others called for caution. The archives show that the Church could no longer act as harshly as it did in Galileo's time and was forced to adapt to the new era. Another important topic is the Vatican's relationship with the United States of America. In the 19th century, this country grew rapidly, and along with immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Poland, a large Catholic community appeared there. The Vatican archives hold letters from American bishops who described the difficulties, persecution by Protestants, the need for new churches, and problems with poverty. For the papal curia, these reports were important. They showed that Catholicism was becoming a world religion, not just a European one. In the second half of the 19th century, the Vatican also actively negotiated with the new states of Latin America that had gained independence from Spain and Portugal. The archives contain diplomatic letters discussing the terms of recognition of these countries and the role of the Church in their lives. Thus, the 19th century documents in the Vatican archives show a remarkable picture. It is not only the history of the Church but also the history of Europe and the world as a whole. Everything is here: the Napoleonic Wars, revolutions in Italy, colonial conquests, scientific discoveries, and the formation of new nations. And most interestingly, most of these documents still remain under-researched. Only a small part is available to historians. The rest are closed volumes, waiting for their time. And perhaps it is there that new facts are hidden that could change our understanding of the 19th century. The 20th century brought Europe and the world unprecedented upheavals. The First and Second World Wars changed the map of the continent, destroyed empires, and created new states and ideologies. But amidst this chaos, there remained a place where all events were recorded: the Vatican archives. There, behind thick walls, documents were kept that show not only the official position of the Holy See but also hidden negotiations, secret missions, and the confessional testimonies of eyewitnesses. The First World War. When the Great War began in 1914, the Vatican found itself in a difficult position. Pope Benedict XV declared neutrality and called for peace. The archives from this period preserve his numerous messages to the monarchs of Europe: Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor Franz Joseph, and King George V. In these letters, he pleaded for an end to the bloodshed. They sounded like the voice of a father trying to stop his children from quarreling. But behind the official speeches were also secret reports. Nuncios from all countries sent detailed messages to Rome about the course of the war, the mood among the population, and the suffering of civilians. The Vatican paid special attention to prisoners of war and refugees. The archives preserve thousands of letters in which mothers begged papal representatives to find their sons or husbands. This was a true humanitarian mission. Papal diplomacy helped to re-establish contact for over 1 million families. These documents show that the archives are not only about politics but also about human destinies. They preserve the voices of those scattered by the war. They prove that even in times of cruelty and destruction, there was a force that tried to unite. The interwar period. After the war, the world changed. New states emerged from the ruins of empires: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Vatican Archives of this time hold treaties on the establishment of diplomatic relations with these countries. The papal curia closely monitored the borders being redrawn on the map of Europe. Of particular interest were the lands of Eastern Europe, where Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and new ideologies met. In 1929, the Lateran Pacts were signed between the Vatican and the government of Benito Mussolini. This treaty created the modern state of Vatican City and defined its status. The archives preserve the protocols of the negotiations, secret meetings, and letters in which papal representatives discussed the terms. This was the moment when the Holy See managed to restore its independence, lost back in the 19th century. The Second World War. But the real test was the Second World War. Pope Pius XII declared neutrality, but his position remains a subject of debate to this day. The Vatican Archives hold thousands of documents from this period: letters to Hitler, Mussolini, Churchill, and Roosevelt, reports from occupied territories, records of the persecution of Jews. One of the most controversial issues is the Vatican's attitude towards the Holocaust. The archives contain evidence that the Pope was informed about the mass exterminations. Nuncios from Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary sent alarming reports. They described ghettos, deportations, and concentration camps. But did the Vatican do enough to stop them? This question still sparks heated debate. There are also other documents that show a different side of the story. For example, letters testifying to the help provided to thousands of Jews to hide and escape. Many monasteries in Rome and other Italian cities opened their doors to the persecuted. The archives preserve the testimonies of those who were saved thanks to this. At the same time, the Vatican tried to be a mediator in secret negotiations. There are protocols of meetings where papal diplomats discussed the possibility of peace between Germany and the Allies. In these documents, we see how the Holy See tried to use its status as a neutral power to save the world from even greater destruction. No less important are the archives on events in Eastern Europe. They contain letters about the persecution of the Catholic Church by the Soviet authorities, about the arrests of priests, and the closure of churches. This was a time when the Vatican closely monitored the spread of communism, understanding that the new ideology posed a threat not only to religion but to all of European civilization. The post-war era. After 1945, the archives preserved a huge array of documents about the reconstruction of Europe. The Vatican was actively involved in humanitarian aid, the restoration of churches, and support for refugees, letters from destroyed parishes, requests for food and medicine, reports from missionaries in starving countries. All this became part of the archival heritage. Interestingly, it was then that the Cold War began, and the Vatican found itself on the front line of the ideological struggle. The archives contain documents about meetings between Pope Pius XII and American diplomats, about plans to contain Soviet influence, and about the creation of Catholic movements in Eastern Europe. The significance of the World War archives. The importance of these documents lies not only in their historical value. They show that during global catastrophes, the Vatican remained a special place, an observer, a mediator, a witness. And although its actions were not always unambiguous, the archives give us the opportunity to see the complexity of that time: fear and courage, inaction and help, silence and words of support. Today, some of these documents are open to researchers. In 2020, the Vatican allowed access to the archives from the time of Pius XII. This has given historians new materials about the Holocaust, relations with the Nazis, and the role of the Church in World War II. But countless volumes remain closed. And who knows what discoveries await us in the future? The Vatican archives from the time of the World Wars are not just a collection of papers. They are a mirror of human history at its most tragic moments. And perhaps it is there, among the yellowed documents, that the answer to the question lies: what makes a person human in times when the world is collapsing? Among the many topics that surround the Vatican archives with an aura of mystery, a special place is occupied by documents related to secret societies, primarily the Freemasons and various religious or semi-religious orders. For it is here, behind thick walls, that letters, reports, intelligence, and bulls are kept, which for decades shaped the Church's attitude towards these forces operating in the shadows. To understand the scale of this topic, one must go back to the 18th century, when Masonic lodges began to spread actively in Europe. Their ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity seemed dangerous to the traditional structures of power, both monarchies and the Church. As early as 1738, Pope Clement XII issued the bull In Eminentia Postulatus Specula, which directly forbade Catholics from joining Masonic lodges. The Vatican archives still hold the original of this document, adorned with a seal. It became the starting point of a centuries-long struggle between the Church and Freemasonry. But the bull was only the tip of the iceberg. The archives themselves hold numerous reports from various countries about lodge meetings in France, Germany, Italy, and even in the colonies. These reports described which influential people participated, what rituals were performed, and what ideas were spread. It was a real surveillance system, and the Vatican meticulously accumulated this data. Interestingly, among these documents are also letters from Freemasons themselves, who appealed to the popes, trying to justify themselves. They wrote that their gatherings had nothing to do with heresy, that they were merely brotherhoods for mutual aid and moral improvement. But for the Vatican, their symbols, secrecy, and independence looked like a threat. No less interesting are the documents concerning other orders. The archives contain records about the restoration of the Jesuit order in the 19th century. After the order was officially suppressed in the 18th century, it continued to exist secretly in many states. Letters arrived in Rome with requests for support, as well as denunciations from opponents who considered the Jesuits too influential. When Pope Pius VII officially restored the order in 1814, the archives received a huge array of new documents about its activities. Another important layer is the history of the Knights Templar. Although the order itself was dissolved back in the 14th century, documents about it remained closed for centuries. Only in the 21st century did the Vatican publish the so-called Chinon Parchment, a document showing that Pope Clement V had effectively forgiven the Templars and recognized their innocence in many of the accusations. But why was this text hidden for so long? This question still has no definitive answer. The archives also contain materials on other medieval orders, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Order of St. Lazarus. Statutes, correspondence with popes, and reports on battles and crusades are preserved there. But among these documents are also more mysterious ones: descriptions of secret vows, reports on internal conflicts, and even evidence of connections with local rulers. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the archives were replenished with another category of documents: reports on new secret societies. These were not only the Freemasons but also the Carbonari, the Illuminati, and various revolutionary brotherhoods. The Vatican closely tracked their activities, understanding that they were behind many political unrests. In reports from France or Italy, one can find the names of specific figures and the dates and places of meetings. This was effectively political intelligence, which we know about today thanks to the archives. Interestingly, in the 20th century, even after World War II, the Vatican continued to monitor the activities of the Freemasons. In 1983, the ban on Catholics joining lodges was reaffirmed. The archives contain documents explaining this position. For the Church, Freemasonry remained a system that promoted a different worldview, often incompatible with Christianity. The mystery of these archives is also that far from everything is open to researchers. Many volumes relating specifically to the Freemasons and other societies remain under the closed classification. This gives rise to many rumors. Some say the Vatican has evidence of connections between famous politicians and Masonic lodges, others suggest that texts explaining the true origin of these orders are stored there. What makes this topic so attractive? Perhaps the very nature of secret societies. They operate in the shadows, use symbols, ciphers, and rituals. And the Vatican, as an institution that has its own rituals and sacred mysteries, saw them as rivals. That is why the archives on Freemasons and orders are not just documents, but a reflection of the struggle for power over human minds. And if we imagine that these documents will one day be fully opened, we might learn the truth about the influence of the Freemasons on revolutions, about their role in the creation of new states, about the hidden connections between politicians and secret lodges. But for now, this truth remains behind closed doors in the silence of the Vatican's repositories. Thus, the secrets about Freemasons and orders in the Vatican archives are a kind of mirror of shadow history. It is the history of those who sought to influence the world unnoticed and those who tried to expose and control them. And as long as these documents remain inaccessible, an atmosphere of mystery and anxiety will always surround them. The Vatican archives have always been an object of special interest for historians, diplomats, and theologians. For long centuries, their doors remained closed to most, and only a select few were allowed to glimpse into this repository, where every document can change our understanding of the past. The history of these researchers has itself turned into a separate drama, as each of them went into the depths of the archives not only for the sake of science but also for the sake of a truth that was always shrouded in politics and religion. The first attempts to study the archives date back to the Renaissance, when humanists became interested in the ancient texts preserved in the Vatican. But at that time, only individual scholars, invited by the popes to work on publishing classical authors, had access. It is known that in the 15th and 16th centuries, figures like Poggio Bracciolini, who discovered and saved many ancient manuscripts, worked in the Vatican. It is thanks to him that the world learned again about the works of Lucretius or Cicero. But even he did not have free access to all the repositories, as the archives always remained an instrument of political control. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the archives became an increasingly closed space, and only diplomats and church historians could get in. Popes allowed the use of specific collections to those who had special permission. For example, scholars from the Jesuit order did enormous work there, preparing their monumental publications on the history of the Church. But their goal was not so much scientific as apologetic, to prove the correctness of Catholicism and support its arguments with documents. The situation began to change in the 19th century. Historical science was growing in Europe, and scholars increasingly demanded access to sources. The popes resisted for a long time, understanding that the archives contained documents that could compromise the Church. But under pressure from the scientific community, as well as due to political circumstances, in 1881, Pope Leo XIII took an unprecedented step. He opened the archives to researchers. From that moment, a new era began, and the first true scholars who received permission to work within the walls of the Vatican entered history. One of the most famous was the German historian Ludwig von Pastor. His work, The History of the Popes, became one of the most complete and thorough of its kind. He worked in the archives for decades, collecting documents about the lives of the pontiffs from the Middle Ages to modern times. His works are still cited today because they were based not on rumors, but on primary sources. Pastor tried to combine scientific objectivity with respect for the Church, and his research became an example of how archives can change historiography. French historians also made a great contribution, for example, Louis Duchesne, a renowned theologian and archaeologist who, at the end of the 19th century, actively used materials from the archives to study the early Church. His works opened new pages in Christian history but also sometimes caused controversy because they did not always coincide with the official position of the Vatican. This revealed a duality: the archives provided access to the truth, but this truth could be dangerous. In the 20th century, the number of researchers grew, and among them were not only Catholics but also Protestants, Orthodox, and even secular scholars. This caused a real explosion in the study of the history of the Church in Europe. For example, the American historian John Tedeschi studied the documents of the Inquisition, particularly in Florence and Venice. His work showed that the Inquisition was a more complex phenomenon than just a court of fire and torture. He discovered in the documents the stories of ordinary people who fell under suspicion. And although part of the Inquisition's archives remained closed, his work gave impetus to a new understanding of the dark side of Church history. One cannot fail to mention the research related to the Second World War. For a long time, the Vatican refused to open the documents from the pontificate of Pius XII, which led to sharp disputes about whether the Pope did enough to help the Jews during the Holocaust. Only in 2020 did the archives of this period become available. Historians from all over the world rushed to Rome. Among them was David Kurtzer, an American historian who had previously written about the Vatican's relations with fascist Italy. His new research showed that Pius received detailed reports about the extermination of the Jews but chose the path of silence. This work caused a huge resonance because it was based on documents that had been inaccessible for decades. It is also worth mentioning other modern researchers, such as Robert Graham, a Jesuit and historian. He worked in the archives for decades on the topic of the Holy See's diplomacy. He proved that the Vatican played an important role in international politics, and his research became the basis for understanding the diplomatic history of the 20th century. His archival findings showed that papal diplomacy has always been a subtle game between faith and the reality of politics. Another important figure was Sergio Pagani, an Italian historian who specialized in medieval documents. He found materials in the collections that shed new light on the activities of the Inquisition against heretics in northern Italy. His research showed how the archives preserved the history not only of great events but also of the daily lives of people caught in the whirlwind of religious conflicts. Access to the archives has always been limited and controlled. Researchers had to submit applications, explain the topics of their research, and wait for permission. And even after gaining access, they could only work with a part of the collections. This created an atmosphere of constant tension. The archives opened their doors, but not completely. Historians always knew that behind the walls were volumes that were inaccessible to them. This feature gave rise to a whole tradition of myths and legends. Some researchers assumed that the closed collections contained documents about alternative gospels, others, that they held information about conspiracies and secret agreements between popes and monarchs. And although most of these versions have no confirmation, the very fact of partial closure only fueled curiosity. The history of the most famous researchers of the Vatican Archives shows us that it is not just a repository of documents, it is a battlefield for history, where every document can become an argument in the great dispute about the past. For some, this research was a matter of science, for others, a matter of faith, and for some, a political act. And every time the archives opened their doors to a new generation of scholars, the world received new knowledge, but at the same time, new questions. Today, the Vatican Archives remain one of the largest repositories in the world, with over 80 kilometers of shelves and millions of documents. And the researchers who worked there continue to open new pages of history for us. But despite all the achievements, the main mystery remains. What other discoveries await us behind closed doors? Documents about lost civilizations. The Vatican Archives are often associated with European history, papal bulls, Inquisition protocols, or correspondence with monarchs. But deep within these repositories lie documents that extend far beyond the European continent. These are materials related to lost civilizations, peoples who left behind only fragments of temples and mysterious legends. And although the Church has always sought to present itself as the guardian of truth, in these documents, we see how carefully it collected evidence about other worlds that had nothing in common with Christianity but were of interest to Rome. The first descriptions of ancient civilizations of the East appeared in these archives early on. Already in the Middle Ages, missionaries sent reports from the Middle East, where they stumbled upon the ruins of ancient cities of Mesopotamia. In their letters, they mentioned ziggurats and mysterious cuneiform tablets, which were not yet understood at the time. These reports were preserved in the Vatican because they recalled biblical stories of Babylon, of the tower that was to reach the sky, of peoples who disappeared in the sands of time. These records are important because they capture the early impressions of Europeans upon encountering civilizations that had vanished long before Europe became the center of the world. Descriptions of ancient Egypt were of particular interest to the papacy. When travelers, pilgrims, and later European scholars described the temples of Luxor or the pyramids of Giza, their reports ended up in Rome. In these documents, which are now kept in the archives, we read about magnificent columns and statues that were striking in their monumentality, and about mysterious hieroglyphs that no one could yet decipher. For the Vatican, these descriptions had not only cultural but also theological significance. They sought confirmation of biblical stories about Moses, the Jewish Exodus, and the 10 plagues. But at the same time, these texts remain one of the oldest European testimonies about the civilization that once ruled the Nile. In the 16th century, the archives began to be filled with completely different materials, stories about the New World. After the expeditions of Columbus and the conquistadors, reports from missionaries and diplomats about the Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations arrived at the Vatican. These were unique texts because they described cultures that Europeans encountered while they were still alive but which were very quickly destroyed by colonization. The letters of Jesuits from Peru preserved descriptions of the temples of Cusco and the sacred rites of the Incas and their gods. In other documents, we find information about the rituals of the Aztecs, their calendar, and the human sacrifices that caused both horror and fascination in Europeans. All of this was carefully noted and sent to Rome, where it became part of the archives. The uniqueness of these documents lies in the fact that they are often the only evidence of lost cultures. Many temples were destroyed, many manuscripts were burned, but the records of the missionaries, even if they were biased, have survived. Thanks to them, we know today about the books of the Maya, the writing system of the Incas, and the priests of the Aztecs. These descriptions contain both a fear of idolatry and an admiration for the wisdom of ancient peoples. And all this lies in the silence of the Vatican's repositories. No less interesting are the documents about the mysterious peoples of Africa. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European travelers brought back news of the ancient kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia. For Rome, the legends of Prester John, a mythical Christian king of the East who was sought for centuries, were of particular interest. The archives contain reports of these searches, letters with descriptions of amazing lands that then still seemed like a land of wonders. Although the myth of Prester John was never confirmed, these documents themselves became part of the history of Europe's contacts with Africa. The Vatican also carefully collected information about the civilizations of Asia. In the 13th century, letters from Franciscans who visited the court of the Mongol Khans arrived in Rome. They described the magnificent palaces of Karakorum, the wealth of the nomadic empire, its laws, and religion. In the 16th to 17th centuries, reports from China appeared, where Jesuits like Matteo Ricci described the imperial court, Confucian texts, and Buddhist temples. For Europe, these records were the first window into the world of the East, and for the Vatican, a source of strategic information about the possibility of spreading Christianity. All these documents about lost civilizations have one thing in common: they show that the Vatican was not isolated from the world. On the contrary, it collected information about all known cultures, regardless of whether they were allies, enemies, or an exotic faraway land. And although these records were often written from a position of Christian criticism, they have left us priceless information about worlds that have already disappeared. There are assumptions that the archives may even contain texts that no one has yet seen. Some historians believe that missionaries brought back manuscripts of the Maya or Incas that were not destroyed but ended up in the repositories. If this is true, then these documents could shed light on the history of civilizations that remain a mystery to us today. However, the Vatican is in no hurry to open all its collections, and so the question remains unanswered. Thus, the documents about lost civilizations in the Vatican Archives are another side of their mystery. They prove that the history of the world has always been global, that even distant peoples left their mark on the memory of Europe. And although many of these civilizations have long since vanished, their voices still sound through the centuries, hidden in the dark corridors of the Vatican. Secret reports and forbidden books. Among the thousands of volumes and yellowed parchments that rest in the Vatican Archives, a special place is occupied by those documents that were never intended for the eyes of the general public. These are secret reports and books that were banned. They constitute one of the most mysterious parts of the archival heritage, because it is here that evidence of knowledge that could undermine the established order or cast a shadow on the authority of the Church is hidden. Back in the Middle Ages, Rome began to create a system that would control not only people's actions but also their thoughts. And at the center of this system was the so-called Index of Forbidden Books, a list of works that Catholics were forbidden to read. This list first appeared in the 16th century, during the Reformation, when the printing press began to spread the ideas of Luther, Calvin, and other dangerous authors throughout Europe. The Vatican realized that the most terrible weapon was not the sword, but the word. And from then on, every book that went against the dogmas could end up on this blacklist. The Vatican Archives hold not only the indexes themselves but also the secret reports of the censors who explained why a particular work was subject to a ban. There one can find arguments against the works of Giordano Bruno, who wrote about the infinity of the universe, or against Montaigne, whose essays questioned established moral norms. There are also records about Galileo, and even about some of Dante's works, which were considered too free-thinking. But the index is only part of the story. The archives themselves hold original copies of the forbidden books that were confiscated by the Inquisition. They were not burned, as is often believed, but set aside in special repositories. Thanks to this, copies of texts that could have been irretrievably lost have survived to our days. Imagine a shelf on which books, for which one could once be sent to the stake, stand side by side. And today they lie silently, as if waiting for their time. In addition to literature, the archives hold secret reports compiled for the Pope. These are reports from nuncios and diplomats who told of political intrigues, the plans of monarchs, and the mood of the people. Many of them were written with the note ad secretum, meaning only for the personal perusal of the pontiff. In these reports, one can find frank confessions that a certain king is planning a war, that a bishop is secretly supporting heretics, or that the people are preparing for an uprising. This was information that could save or destroy entire states. Papal nuncios effectively served as intelligence agents. They sent reports on revolutionary movements, the activities of Masonic lodges, and socialist parties. All this was collected in the archives and formed the basis for the decisions of the Holy See. Some of these documents remain close to this day, as they contain the names of people who collaborated with the Vatican. Particularly interesting are the materials related to science. It is known that in the 16th century, Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres was banned. Although the author himself avoided direct conflict with the Church, his ideas about heliocentrism were too dangerous. The archives hold reports from theologians who argued that this book contradicted the Holy Scripture. Only a century later was the ban lifted from it. But the very fact that a work that changed science was once considered dangerous shows the power of church censorship. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and later Marx and other thinkers whose ideas challenged traditional views were added to the list of forbidden books. In secret reports, censors warned the Pope that these books were corroding morality and could incite the people to riot. All this was recorded and filed in the archives, which still preserve evidence of how dangerous words were considered. But perhaps the most intriguing are those books that we do not even know about. There are numerous assumptions that the Vatican Archives hold texts of apocryphal Gospels that were not included in the canonical Bible, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and other Gnostic texts. All of them were rejected by the Church, but copies could have been preserved as dangerous. If this is true, then the archives contain not only the history of the Church but also alternative versions of Christian teaching itself. In the 20th century, the Index of Forbidden Books gradually lost its power. It was officially abolished in 1966 by Pope Paul VI. But the very fact of its existence for 4 centuries left a deep mark on culture. And today, the archives preserve this memory, tens of thousands of pages with records of which books were banned and why. The secret reports and forbidden books in the Vatican archives are a reminder that power over knowledge was often more important than power over land. For he who controls the word also controls the mind. And although today we live in a world where access to information seems limitless, the shadows of the past remind us, there have always been those who decided what could be known and what must remain in darkness. It is this part of the archives that still raises the most questions, because even after opening many volumes, the Vatican leaves many closed. And as long as they are inaccessible, we can only guess what other books lie there, wrapped in the dust of centuries, and what reports were never meant for our eyes. Modern times and access to the archives. Today, when we talk about the Vatican archives, we are faced not only with an image of the past but also with a living question of the present. These repositories, which occupy over 80 kilometers of shelves, remain one of the most closed and, at the same time, attractive institutions in the world. They arouse interest not only among historians but also among politicians, journalists, cultural researchers, and even ordinary people who want to understand what secrets are still hidden behind the thick walls of the Vatican. Formally, the archives began to gradually open to scholars in the 19th century. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII allowed historians to work with a part of the collections, and this was a real breakthrough. Since then, each subsequent pope has taken certain steps to expand access. But even today, only parts of the archives are open, and many documents still remain inaccessible. The reason is simple: they contain information that could affect political relations, cast a shadow on the authority of the Church, or simply cause too much debate. In the 20th century, access was extended to materials from the Middle Ages, and later to the modern era. However, the issue of the 20th century remained closed for a long time. Only recently, in 2020, Pope Francis opened the collections relating to the pontificate of Pius XII, the pope who led the Church during the Second World War. This was an unprecedented step, as this period caused the most controversy. For years, historians had demanded to see the documents to learn the truth. What did the Pope know about the Holocaust? What actions did he take? Why did his silence raise questions for so long? When the archives were opened, researchers received thousands of documents, letters from nuncios, reports from occupied territories, and private records. It turned out that the Vatican knew more than it said. But it was also clear that the situation was more complex than it seemed. The Church tried to balance the desire to help with the fear of total destruction. The process of working in the archives today is also very specific. A researcher must submit an application, explain the topic of their research, and obtain official permission. After that, they are given access to the catalog and are allowed to order documents. But even here, there are strict restrictions. Only a few folders can be received per day. Documents cannot be photographed or copied without special permission. Everything must remain under control. This creates an atmosphere as if you are touching something sacred, but at the same time very fragile. The archive premises themselves resemble a huge underground labyrinth, corridors with metal shelves, long rows of boxes and manuscripts, some of which have not been opened for centuries. There are also special rooms where a constant temperature and humidity are maintained so that the parchments do not deteriorate. For a researcher, being there is a feeling like being a time traveler, turning pages written 5, 7, or even 10 centuries ago. But access to the archives is not the same for everyone. For example, documents from the last 100 years are opened gradually and always with some delay. There are topics that remain particularly sensitive: the role of the Church in colonial processes, relations with totalitarian regimes, the financial agreements of the Vatican. These materials lie in the repositories, but only a select few have the keys to them. Often, the Vatican explains the secrecy of the archives as a concern for researchers. They say that information can be misinterpreted or used for political purposes. But for many historians, this sounds like an excuse, because it is in these documents that the answers to questions that humanity has been asking for centuries may lie. Why were some heresies destroyed so cruelly? What was the real role of the popes in wars and conspiracies? Do apocryphal texts that could change our understanding of Christianity really exist? In modern times, the archives perform another function: they have become a symbol of the Church itself. When the Vatican takes a step towards openness, it is perceived as a gesture of transparency, a readiness to speak the truth. When the doors remain closed, it gives rise to new myths and suspicions. Thus, the archives influence the image of Catholicism in the world. Today, hundreds of researchers from different countries work in the Vatican Archives. They come there from Germany, France, Poland, the USA, and even from Japan or Latin America. Everyone is looking for something of their own. Someone is studying the history of their country, someone the development of science, someone diplomatic relations. The archives have become a kind of bridge between science and religion, between the past and the present. But at the same time, accessibility remains relative. Many collections simply cannot be catalogued in time. Imagine millions of documents waiting for systematization. Some of them are discovered by chance, others may lie there for decades more. For a historian, this is both a temptation and a test. You know that behind the wall could be a discovery capable of turning history upside down, but you cannot reach it. In the modern era, the Vatican is also taking steps forward. Some documents have already been digitized, which allows them to be worked with remotely. But this is only a small fraction, mostly those materials that do not constitute a particular secret. The most valuable and sensitive information is still kept only on parchment and paper. This again creates a duality. The world is moving towards openness, but the archives remain an island of silence and secrecy. Modern access to the archives is a balance between the desire to reveal the truth and the need to preserve authority. The Vatican has always been a master of diplomacy, and its archives work in the same way, to open just enough to show a readiness for dialogue and to leave the rest closed to maintain control. And perhaps it is this strategy that makes the archives even more attractive, because where there is a mystery, there will always be interest. For humanity today, the Vatican Archives are not just a repository of history, they are a mirror of our attitude towards the truth. We always want to know more than we are allowed, and we always suspect that something extraordinary is hidden behind closed doors. And perhaps that is their main strength. The archives remain alive not because they are opened, but because they still hide more than they show. Friends, thank you for being with me on this journey through the secrets of the Vatican Archives.